So, as Monty Python would say, and now for something completely different. I'll be presenting this at PIA in a session on spatial effects on partnering and race. I'm presenting it on behalf of my co-authors, Elias Saperstein and Andrew Penner, and myself. And the title of the talk is Placing Racial Fluidity in Context. This is situated in a larger literature on racial fluidity, showing that in the United States, racial fluidity is sort of a larger component than it was sort of previously thought. There's sort of more racial fluidity going on than we had previously expected, and it seems to be patterned in somewhat meaningful ways. So for this project, we're interested in sort of trying to understand contextual variation in this racial fluidity. So specifically, are there places in the United States where fluidity in racial classification is more likely to occur? And also, can we sort of try to explain some of this contextual variation? So are there some covariates, such as like the unemployment rate, the crime rate, poverty rates, population composition, things that we might expect from previous research to sort of influence racial classification and fluidity? And also, do these predictors vary across place? So this is sort of grounded in sort of thinking about race as a socially constructed category. Ian Hacking, in his 1999 book, The Social Construction of What, has this quote talking about the social construction of categories, in this case, genius or anorexia. He talks about it, it's not that we're necessarily talking about the characteristics of genius or anorexia sort of as truly objective objects, but we're talking about more sort of the ideas surrounding these categories, the individuals who fall under these categories, the interaction between the two, and sort of the manifold of social practices and institutions that these interactions involve. And Hacking terms this the sort of matrix of social construction. And so the idea for this project is, what ideas do we use with sort of our implicit matrix when we classify individuals by race in the United States? And again, do these ideas vary with space? So the data for this project come from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and we use the 1979 cohort. And it includes racial classifications recorded by interviewers from 1979 to 1998. It's panel data, so we can see when individuals change in their classified race. It also includes characteristics of the interviewers and a whole host of background information about the respondents. And we have access to the restricted use data, which is geocoded. And that allows us to sort of situate the respondents into their county of residence and link it to data drawn from city and county data books, uniform crime reports from the FBI, regional economic accounts from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We also use decennial census data. So first of all, there does seem to be some patterning in racial fluidity. Sort of American Southwest, sorry if the color's not coming through. Darker colors correspond to higher rates of racial fluidity, measured by taking the proportion of person years where individual's race changes divided by the total number of person years in the state. And so we see, again, the Southwest and Ohio and Michigan have the highest rates of fluidity. These roughly correspond to the 2010 census data, the states where there was the highest reporting of mixed race categories. There's kind of a mismatch since we're talking about two different time periods. We're talking about the 80s and the 90s in 2010 census, but it's plausible that there's some relationship between the two. So as we try to explain some of this variation, we're interested in experiences that changes that an individual experiences over time. And so we're interested in sort of changing contexts of that individual. There are sort of two fundamental ways that context could change and thus shape racial classification. People can move and change context that way. Also, contexts can change around individuals who stay put. Surprisingly, perhaps, racial fluidity is not actually more common among those who move between counties. So in the year in which an individual moves to a new county, 5.7% experience a change in racial classification. Among those who stay put, it's 5.9%. Additionally, the contexts for the people who move versus the people who stay are surprisingly similar. So despite the fact that people are moving to new contexts, the unemployment rate, poverty, crime rates are very similar for movers and stayers. Movers do tend to end up in larger places, so larger population sizes, with more Black and Hispanic neighbors. Stayers see a larger increase in the percent foreign-born. So to sort of tease out the effects of these contextual variations, we estimate 3 linear probability regression models, and we predict in each of these models the classification by an interviewer is either white, black, or other, and the reference category in these models is versus all other categories. The models include county-level covariates, as well as the interactions to account for moving between counties. So interactions between moving to a county and the county characteristics. So we essentially estimate the effects of context for stayers and movers separately. And we also include individual status characteristics, age, region, interviewer controls, as well as individual fixed effects and near fixed effects. So we're looking at changes that an individual experiences. And this would sort of control out fixed and static characteristics of an individual. So some of our key findings, we find that the category of black is very stable compared to white or other. And we sort of see this in several ways. First, the fixed effects we included in our models account for nearly 98% of the variation when we predict classification as black, whereas in models predicting classification as white, it's 85%, and other it's 48%. Additionally, when we model the probability of being classified as black, most of our contextual covariates fail to reach statistical significance. For classification as white or other, there do seem to be some contextual covariates that may matter sort of on the margin. So in this example, the unemployment rate, aggregate poverty, percent foreign-born, and a measure of ethno-racial diversity in a county sort of all lead to increased probabilities of being classified as other, decreased probabilities of being classified as white. Percent Hispanic goes the opposite direction. It is important to note that these effects are statistically significant, but very small in magnitude. So a 1% increase in the unemployment rate leads to a 0.2% increase in the probability of being classified as other. So very small effects. So in addition to these sort of national estimates, we're also interested in if these sort of underlying meanings of what these estimates represent may change with place. So what we do is we estimate a geographically weighted regression. Essentially, we take each state and the data for that state, as well as states within a 500-mile radius, and we only use that local data to estimate the same regression model. Then we iterate through all states to create local, sort of state-by-state regression estimates. We then sort of look at the spatial variation in coefficient estimates to see if there is some spatial non-stationarity of our estimates. I should note the results I'm about to show are preliminary and exploratory. There's sort of more statistical work that could and should be done here, but so take with a grain of salt, but hopefully it's somewhat interesting. So this is the case for unemployment, and again, this is in the context of all the additional controls I mentioned earlier. And it looks like while the national estimate for unemployment is that it reduces the probability of being classified as white, when we look at the spatial variation, that seems to be mostly true on the East Coast. Whereas on the West Coast, unemployment actually increases the probability of being seen as white. And the sort of effects for other mirror these, so increases probability of being seen as other on the East Coast, decreases on the West Coast. Effects for black sort of fail to reach significance. I should note that these are supposed to be gray, projector. I've obscured the data where the coefficient fails to reach statistical significance to try to avoid overinterpretation of these spatial patterns. So larger populations seem to have a similar pattern, and again, for all of these maps, you can think of the classification as other as sort of the mirror image. So larger populations lead to lower odds of being seen as white on the East Coast, but higher odds of being seen as white on the West Coast. Foreign-born has the opposite relationship, so increases on the East, decreases on the West. There are some characteristics that have sort of more nationally homogeneous effects. Increasing ethno-racial diversity in the county in which people live tends to decrease the odds of being seen as white fairly universally. Percent Hispanic is the opposite. So it increases the likelihood of being seen as white fairly uniformly across the United States. So in conclusion, racial fluidity is indeed more common in some places than in others. Contextual characteristics can help to predict racial classification, but the effects may be small and they also vary by place. Some effects may be national, others may be regional or local. Part of the reason why some of our estimates are so small could be that we're averaging sort of positive effects and negative effects if there are sort of multiple regimes of racial classification. This suggests that survey interviewers may sort of bring with them some stereotypes of sort of what they expect to see when they see race. And that may then influence what they perceive and how they classify individuals, and that these stereotypes may sort of be different in Eastern and Western regimes of racial classification. As acknowledgements, I'd like to thank the Russell Sage Foundation and a training grant from the NICHD for supporting this work. I should also note that this research was conducted with the restricted access data, and the views expressed here do not necessarily represent the BLS. Thank you very much.
You didn't talk about actual proportions of mixed race people, but wouldn't you expect the actual proportion of mixed race people to be a main driver?
So,
in places where people have lots of mixed racial identity, the categories get jumped.
yeah, so in the NLSY data, there sort of are no mixed race people. The categories that interviewers get to use to classify individuals are white, black, or other. They're sort of restricted to that. Similarly, those questions sort of started to be asked on the census after our survey period. So we're looking at 80s through 90s, which did not allow you to check multiple boxes on the form. So I agree that that would be an interesting covariate to look at, but unfortunately it's not available in our data.
But the geography of it is available today.
True, if we assume that sort of the mixed race categories that we see today sort of have been there for a long time, we could then use it to sort of estimate currently.
Well, Aaron Gullickson used to do a lot on colorism and coloring, surely in a black-white distinction. Color, if it's being assessed, makes a big difference, and actual racial mixture matters to color.
True, yes. Yeah, it just requires an assumption of sort of relative stability of those things over time. And it is also important to note that most of our effects are sort of between classification as white and classification as other. Classification as the sort of white-black distinction is less playing a role here. Josh.
So just one concrete thing on the presentation. The first map where you have the proportions changing seems to be really, really important. So I would work on that picture with big scale.
Okay.
Spend some time on it just so we get a sense of what we're talking about.
Okay.
As it gets more complicated later, you go faster, it won't matter. The subsequent question is, I would have guessed that people's unchanging characteristics are a big predictor of whether their race changes or not, whether you're poor or rich, whether you're Hispanic or non-Hispanic, all these kind of things. Is there a reason you don't begin with just kind of main effects before you start differencing out?
So before the fixed effects?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so part of that is a sort of a concern that some of what may be driving racial fluidity is like measurement error. And so by sort of controlling for individual stable characteristics, we can sort of, if there is noise in our measurement, it sort of gets us the most robust estimate. So, for example, if you do a simulation exercise and you assume that there's measurement error and that people with certain socioeconomic backgrounds experience sort of some racial classifications more than others, sort of if you flip the stratification question, for example, such that people who are poor tend to be black, just because black people tend to be more poor, then those in a scenario with measurement error, then it looks like there's a lot of racial fluidity that is predicted by those characteristics, simply as a product of people sort of having baseline flow. So we try to control for that scenario by including sort of individual fixed effects off the bat.
My personal reaction would be that there's an interest in that measurement error itself. I may be interested in going beyond what you call measurement error, but that measurement error and that changing classification by the coder is one level of it. I mean, it's something that I think your audience would be interested in. I would be interested in it. Who is more likely to have their race changed for whatever reason? And then the further question of, is there something beyond coder uncertainty, which I guess is another version of...
I should clarify, I'm not talking about coder uncertainty. So these are sort of, when I talk about measurement error, that refers to sort of simulation exercises where the change in classification is entirely randomly distributed. So we are talking a lot about sort of ambiguities and people changing contexts because of being perceived in different ways. I would not necessarily call that measurement error necessarily.
So is the major thing you're seeing people going, we think not in your data, people who are kind of Hispanic something and sometimes they're white, sometimes they're other, is that what you think is the majority of what's going on?
Yes, there's sort of, if you look in the data, if you just look at the amount of racial fluidity that's occurring, the sort of white and other categories are sort of vast majority of...
We have some measure of Hispanicity somewhere that you...
Yeah, it was asked in the 1978 screener, but it wasn't asked in sort of consecutive waves through 78.
So that basic story doesn't come through in your talk. It's what I'm guessing is happening because of my own work on this, but maybe again when you show that first map, to kind of tell people what we're talking about here, especially since you start with 3 regressions of black, white, other, and then you say, oh, by the way, I'm not going to talk about blacks. Not, I mean, don't quite say that, but it leads us down the wrong line, which your talk really is about something quite specific that could be emphasized.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I don't have this data history down, but you do have data going back a long way on foreign-born and country of origin, or you don't?
No. Well, yes and no. We have foreign-born in the entire analysis, taken from the decennial census, which we...
Yeah, that's what I mean, from other sources, from the census.
Well, from the decennial census. So if you want annual estimates of that, we'd have to get from like the...
Yeah, but there's interpolation or whatever. I mean, it seems to me you can do more to address the issues that Ken has raised that seem to me really important for understanding what's going on.
So percent foreign-born is included in these models.
Yeah, but it would be, you wouldn't want percent foreign-born, but rather percent of Asian or Latin American origin or African origin or something like that.
We do have ethno-racial diversity, which is a sort of index of how diverse a neighborhood is. So based on how many categories there are, if most people fall into one category, that measure will be lower. So that's the diversity index. What we don't have is an individual being classified in multiple categories.
But you do have the contextual sense of degree of racial or race ethnic diversity.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So you're talking a lot about moving, but when you're talking about moving, you're talking about moving spatially.
Yes.
Did you, maybe I missed it, but do you also control for moving between social classes?
Moving between, I mean...
Because you'd expect this fluidity of race to also be associated to a life cycle change.
To the extent to which it's picked up in our individual controls, which include experience of poverty, incarceration, unemployment, we don't have income directly.
Yeah, but these are not time varying, are they?
They are. We're using, if they've ever experienced those status categories, we think that they're kind of sticky. The effects don't change very much if we use sort of individual year estimates. But yeah, those individual sort of status characteristics are included as controls. Danny?
I'm just going to address some of the same questions we were asked this question, which is, I feel like in the setup you could take another minute, because I think you have exactly 1 extra minute. To say, I mean, maybe most people in the room will know what racial fluidity is, but you look at, some people are there for Rob Maier's paper on segregation and disordered debating. So you say, this is what racial fluidity is, here's how common it is based on prior work. Prior research has shown, by you guys, like that some individual level characteristics matter for this, and some, family background characteristics matter for this type of fluidity. What we could just say more clearly, what we don't know is about, and you do see some of this, but you could even just really orient us even more clearly to it. I think we use like a definition of the term, how common it is, that will help us size the effects later too, and then some background view control level stuff. Well, that's
No, great, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Please hand me your